Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 to 15, under the heading, Jesus sent them out. It's our common experience that when we read the Bible, there often seems to be a great gap, a great distance between it and us. And sometimes we have to work hard to figure out what the relevance is to us. There is so much in this particular passage that is of its time. And we have to recognize and respect that Jesus sent out the 12, out the apostles. They were apostles and we aren't apostles. So there is a difference. He gave them remarkable, miraculous powers, authority to do such things as heal every kind of disease. I can't do that. That hasn't been given to me in the way it was given to the apostles. He limited their mission. It was a particular mission that they were sent out onto, and it was right for them at that time, given God's purposes and history, to go to the Jews only, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And now we are commanded to go out into all the world and preach the gospel. So we do have to take account of things that were different then from the way they are now. Otherwise, we will have false expectations about what we can do. We will have false ideas about who we are. We'll have false ideas about the extent or the limitation of the people we should go to. And we must never make those mistakes. But there is very, very much here that is vitally relevant to us. And those are the things that I want to focus on this morning. It's a simple message, really. Probably things that we all know, but things that it's very important to underline again, to get our sense of, as God's people, what he has called us to do. I've got 5 points, and I shan't belong under any of them. And the first concerns what we do. So Jesus' instruction to his 12 apostles, disciples was, verse 7, and proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Now, of course, as the people of God and as the church of God, there are many things that it's right and good for us to do. And that we ought to do, and we ought to be careful to do all that Christ has commanded us to do. But there is something that we must focus on and that we must never neglect to do, and it is, in a sense, the thing that we as the people of God, as the church of God alone are able to do, and that is to proclaim the gospel. Nobody else can do that. No other agency can do that. No other organization cares to do that. It is central to our raison d'etre. It's our reason for existence, or one of the central reasons for our existence. We proclaim, so that the 12 apostles were under Jesus' authority and instruction to do that, and we are too. So what is it? For those who are interested, the Greek word is kerusso, and it means to publish. It means to proclaim as a herald. It means to announce openly and publicly. And so its central idea is that there is a message, that there is good news, and we need to get the word out into the open so that people can know it. Now, I'm very proud indeed of the fact that my wife is the author and contributor to a number of books. If I'd had time, I would have remembered to get one of them from our bookshelf and wave it in front of the camera. And I'm sure I'm embarrassing her even as I speak. And I'm very proud of her indeed. I do need to say, though, that they're not bestsellers. They are of narrow interest to macroeconomists. And if you have an interest in macroeconomics, then you're likely to look out those tomes and read them. But otherwise, you won't have heard of her books. I'm afraid. The proclamation that we're involved in is not like the academic work that is of narrow interest, for which you have to have a sort of predisposed interest and or be prepared to hunt it out for yourself. No, without demeaning it, I want to say that the gospel that we proclaim is more like the billboard. It's designed to make the message public, unmistakable, accessible, and clear. It wants as many people as possible at the crossroads of life to see it and to understand it with as little difficulty as possible. And that's what the 12 were to do, and that's what Jesus sends us to do. It's essentially getting the word across. That's what it is. It's no more technical than that. We're not only in proclamation or in preaching to imagine a chapel or a church building with an elevated pulpit, with a man in a tie standing behind the lectern, delivering a 30-minute sermon to a largely attentive and appreciative audience. That's good when that happens, and I've certainly got no quibble with that. But this is not confined to that. This is getting the word across. It is in discussion among friends. It is in dialogue and debate. It is in explorers, Sunday school classes to children. That's what parents, Christian parents, do perhaps around the dinner table with their children. It's open air preaching. And it is Sunday sermons. It is our essential work. And if we fail to do it, nobody else will do it. Our constant concern then must be, how can we make the gospel public knowledge? How, in the best possible sense, can we popularize it? How can we get people who are ignorant of it to know it? That's what we do, and we do it under Jesus' authority. The second of my 5 points concerns what we say, also in verse 7 of Matthew chapter 10. So Jesus said to them, "And proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand." So there's a kind of a shorthand of what the 12 apostles, when they went out, what the content of their message was. So they were not innovators. They were not free to make up their own minds as to what the message would be, but rather they were told by Jesus to convey this message: the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Now, why didn't he say, preach Jesus Christ and him crucified and risen from the dead, which of course is central to the gospel message? Well, remember where we are in time and space and history, that Jesus has not yet been crucified, that Jesus has not yet risen from the dead. It's quite clear then why the message at this stage is not focusing on those things, not because they're not important, but because they've not happened. And they will, in due course, very soon come to center stage. Remember what Paul said to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15 from verse 3. He said, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures." That is of first importance. And Paul delivered that to his hearers as of first importance, and we do too. But what Jesus is saying here in referring to the kingdom of heaven is entirely consistent with that message, and it remains relevant and central to us and to our message. Let me explain. What is the kingdom of heaven all about? Could you answer that question? Here's a working definition. It's 2 lines in my notes. I hope it's not too long for you, and then I'll explain it. The kingdom of heaven, it is the beneficial reign of the promised king over a people made willing by grace to submit to him. It's a reign that has begun and comes to its fullness in the eternal future. It's the beneficial reign of the promised king over a people made willing by grace to submit to him. It has already begun and it comes into its fullness in the eternal future. If that's too much of a mouthful for you, then let me break it down and explain it. You see, there is a king. There is a king. It is the Lord Jesus Christ, God manifest in the flesh, King of kings and Lord of lords, all divine authority and sovereignty vested in him. There is a king. There is therefore a kingdom. It is his reign. It is his reign of grace by which he comes to people who are rebels against God's authority and in rebellion against him, and he subdues their rebellion. He, by grace, entirely changes their view of him, and he wins them over to himself as devoted subjects who gladly obey him. It's from heaven. It's the kingdom of heaven. That's what makes it such good news. I contrasted with the children earlier the difference between living under the reign of a bad and an evil king and under the reign of a good and a wise king. It's very different, isn't it? Really, really matters who rules over you. And the trouble with our human rulers is that none of them are good enough. The best of them are not. I don't mean to offend anyone here, but it always, in previous presidential elections in the United States, it's always sort of bemused me that the populace, or half the populace, invests so much expectation. This new presidency is going to bring everything we wanted. And then after 100 days, it's just not looking so good anymore. Of course, things are a little bit different in this election, I think. You and I have been around the block enough to know that there is no government, no prime minister, no party, no king, no queen who can ever live up to our expectations or their promises. We are always disappointed. Given the greatness of our need as a fallen human race and as sinners, we just can't look in the direction of any other mere human being or government agency to rescue us. It has to come from outside. It has to come from above. It has to come from heaven. We need help from God. We need the kingdom of heaven. We need a king who has come down from heaven and is able to rescue us. There is a king. There is a kingdom. It's come from heaven. This king's reign, I said, is a beneficial reign. I tried to sketch that out for the children earlier. He's a king who blesses his subjects with all of the gracious benefits of his reign. Once you've got the facts, it actually defies explanation why anyone should reject Jesus as their Lord. It defies explanation. Because when you submit to him, you receive a great salvation. You receive a redemption from the slavery of sin. You receive the forgiveness of sins and a cleansed conscience. You receive the hope of an eternal inheritance. You receive a reason for living. You receive somebody to be devoted to and to follow. You receive commands that are light and not heavy. That's what you receive. It's a beneficial reign. No wonder Christians are happy to be Christians. It is an eternal kingdom. It has already begun. That's what Jesus is saying. It's his point in verse 7. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. You see, when the king has come, the kingdom has come. And he's effectively saying, here standing before you is the king of this kingdom. It's come. And now that he's coming, his reign will never end. Oh, it will be resisted. In our own time, we have to say that the majority of this nation's population, of the world's population, are not bowing to and recognizing Jesus as the King of Kings. But there is a day coming when all of that will be put right. And it is captured in the words that I read at the beginning of our service. God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. In other words, you can only go on for so long denying and defying the inevitable and the true, that Jesus is Lord, and everyone will have to recognize it one day. So do you see then that while the kingdom of heaven is at hand is not, in a sense, is not focusing on the death and resurrection of Christ, but it's entirely compatible with it, and in fact is an essential, and I wonder whether you've forgotten this, and it's an essential core of our message. Remove the kingdom and king themes from the gospel, and it's an emasculated message. There is no sovereignty, there is no reign, there is no one to submit to, there's no one to admire, there's no one to worship, there's no one who can command the blessing. It's essential that is our message, and it is essential personally that we are submissive to and devoted to this King of grace. So those are the first 2 points, what we do and what we say. The third point is what motivates us. What motivates us? So verse 8 says, in terms initially that I think are quite clearly particularly applicable to the apostles: heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. And then he says something that is utterly timeless. You received without paying, give without pay, or freely you received, freely give. In other words, God's free grace is not only at the core of our message, and it is, but it also governs our attitude and motivation and spirit as the messengers. So Jesus is sending the 12 out, and he's saying, be governed by this spirit, be dominated by this spirit and motive. You have freely received, now freely give. Very important, and people will detect if our motive is wrong. Sorry to those who've heard this illustration before, but there's some who haven't. He's dead now, but Martin Holt was a pastor in South Africa. And I remember him once sharing how his encounter with a Jehovah's Witness. So he was at home, and as tends to happen, the Jehovah's Witness knocked on the door. Martin answered the door. The Jehovah's Witness asked if he could come in and share his message. And Martin said, yes, you can do that on one condition. Okay, what's that condition? The condition is that you answer one question. I'm going to put one question to you that you answer it, okay? And Martin said, but I'm going to insist that you promise in advance to answer that question honestly, okay? The Jehovah's Witness agreed to that. So Martin then said to him, here's the question. Why are you going door to door? Is it for your salvation or is it for mine? Well, the poor bloke had promised to be honest, and he had to admit, I'm doing this for me. I'm going around door to door trying to earn my salvation. In other words, it's for me, really. It's not for you. And Martin had made his point. Doesn't that undermine the message when the messenger is just doing it for himself? And Jesus in this statement is removing that possibility. He's saying, freely you received, freely give. There's nothing to earn. You've already got all the benefits of my gracious reign. You've got full salvation. You've received it without earning it. And so as you go out, you're not burdened by a sense of, will I do this well enough or do enough of it or speak to enough people in order to make sure that I earn my way to heaven? All of that is just swept off the table, and is not, you've received freely, now freely give. And that's the characteristic that Jesus would have in his messengers. This is the governing principle of what we do. This is what motivates us. We have a religion of grace. We deserve nothing. There is nothing for us to earn. All that we have has been freely given to us. Generosity is our hallmark, or at least ought to be. We give the gospel, we give ourselves, we give our time, we give our hospitality, we give our money. We're not meeting as we usually do, but if you normally meet with us, you'll notice that our habit is not to pass around the collection plate. The last thing we want people to think is that we want something from them, at least of all their money. That's not what we want. We want to give. We've got a message. That's what we want you to take away. And that's freely you've received, freely give. It governs our message. It governs our attitude. It's the spirit, the ethos of what we communicate. Carolyn and I remember a conference. Sorry, I've just dropped my notes, so I better retrieve them. Thank you. My esteemed author wife picked them up for me. How's that? Carolyn and I remember going to a conference where there was a conference topic that was in the program, the mercy of God, and the speaker was had a fine reputation, and we went with eagerness to listen to this man speak, and the room sort of turned cold as he spoke. He was speaking about the mercy of God, but there was nothing generous about his spirit. There was nothing warm-hearted in what he said. It was a kind of icy coldness. It was dreadful. We can't be like that if we've grasped the fact that freely we have received and freely we give. That's what motivates us. Fourthly, who we depend on. Who we depend on. Now, verses 9 and 10 read like this. Jesus instructs his disciples, acquire no gold, nor silver, nor copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, nor 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. Now, I think that the details of that are time-bound, but the principle is timeless. I think it's right that missionaries should go out having managed to raise enough support so that they can get on with the work without having to worry about where the next meal is going to come from. It seems to me that what Jesus did here for what was essentially a relatively short-term mission was to teach them an enduring object lesson. Don't take stuff that will make you feel secure. So when you're in a tight corner, you can resort to the contents of your wallet. And I would say then that the Lord imposed unique restrictions on the apostles for the duration of this particular mission in order to teach them an enduring lesson about dependence on him. What were they to learn from leaving everything behind and going out without the normal supports? Luke chapter 22 and verse 35 in a similar context spells it out. And he said to them, when I sent you out without money belt and bag and sandals, you did not lack anything, did you? They said, no, nothing. That's a wonderful statement, that, isn't it? When you went out with nothing, you didn't lack anything, did you? No, they said. Our experience was, remarkably, we went out with nothing, but we didn't lack anything. And that's what you have to learn. And that the work of God proceeds, it seems, on that basis. That meager resources do not need to hamper gospel work. That when you have nothing, actually you don't lack anything. And that the Lord is able to provide for us exactly what we need and all that we need. It's a spiritual work, and the fruitfulness of this work and of any gospel enterprise, we have to learn, depends utterly on God. We need to learn that lesson well. It will remove our pride. It will make us humble. It will make us dependent. It will make us prayerful. I didn't get permission from Don and Christine for this. Don and Christine, I hope that I'm not doing something here that I shouldn't. And you can get the fuller story from Don and Christine. They shared it with us last evening, how when in Lusaka they were ministering to the street boys and they didn't have sufficient accommodation to take them all in. They needed bigger accommodation, and they found the ideal property in Lusaka. They raised all the money that they could possibly muster, and they were £15,000 short. It just seems to be, that's the story of gospel work. We're £15,000 short. There doesn't ever seem to be a surplus. The owners who were selling the property had another offer, and were not willing to accept Don and Christine's offer that fell 15,000 short. So that was apparently the end of the deal, except they very movingly shared last evening that a businessman who had read their newsletter, that hadn't made an appeal for money, had received an annual bonus, and that night tossed and turned and was unable to sleep, and phoned them the next morning and asked them whether he could give them £15,000. And then they went and took the full amount offered to the sellers, and the owners said, you know, God must have wanted you to have this property, because we have been trying for 24 hours to contact the other interested party who'd made an offer, but their phone was dead. We just couldn't get through. It seems that we have to learn that lesson, and probably learn it repeatedly, that meager resources need not hamper gospel work. That when you have nothing, you do not lack anything. That Jesus would say to us, when I sent you out without money, belt and bag and sandals, you did not lack anything, did you? They said, no, nothing. Finally, my fifth point. I didn't really know how to state this, but here it is. Why we tremble. Why we tremble. Well, trembling isn't there in the passage, but I think, let me just read to you verses 11 to 15 and make my point, and then I'm finished. And whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it and stay there until you depart. As you enter the house, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. Jesus is saying that associated with this work of proclaiming the kingdom of heaven, there is temporal judgment and there is a final judgment. So this is solemn stuff. And if you understand it correctly, it makes you tremble. There is a temporal judgment. You see, they were to go and they were to speak to people. And when they had finished speaking to people, they were to leave people in absolutely no doubt that, depending on the way they responded to the message, that they knew where they stood in relation to God. That if they accepted the message, all was well with their soul. But if they rejected the message, well, as was the custom at that time, the disciples were to depart from them, shaking off the dust from their feet. In other words, conveying a message that would have been quite clear to them: you are not numbered among the people of God. Now, that's not a final judgment. It could be that in a year's time that somebody else would come with the gospel and they would be aware. So it's not a final judgment. It's just saying that right now you need to know that if you've welcomed and embraced and received the message, all is well with your soul. You are one of the people of God. But if you've rejected it, you must know that you are not numbered among the people of God whose sins are forgiven and who are heirs of salvation. Now, they weren't to do that in a harsh tone. Some of you will know the name Al Martin, was an American preacher from some decades ago. And I can remember him telling a story against himself. He said that when he was young, he and zealous in America, he would get on the local buses with his Christian tracts, and he would go from person to person in the bus and ply them with these Christian tracts. And if somebody didn't take the tract, he said, well, I would stand there and preach them into hell. And then he said, what a dreadful attitude. In fact, probably confused rejection of his tract with rejection of the gospel. It became a personal duel between him and that poor bus passenger. If you don't accept my tract, well, I'm going to let you have it, both barrels. No, that's the wrong spirit. That doesn't commend the message. That's not what the disciples were doing. It was just, there was another preacher, I forget his name now, who years ago, I can't remember if it was a talk or a book, but what he exhorted preachers to, he said that what you must be involved with is preaching that demands a verdict. Preaching that demands a verdict. In other words, he's saying to preachers, don't preach a sermon that after 30 minutes, people are kind of confused, don't know what that was about, don't know what to respond to, and can go away changed. No, he said, be quite clear, like the prosecuting lawyer in a courtroom, that all of the content and the arguments are marshaled so that at the end you say yes or you say no. And he's saying, preaching that demands a verdict. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, go out and let people know what's at stake. That when you've finished, if they've accepted what you say, all is well. But if they haven't, they are not numbered amongst the people of God. There is a temporal judgment then. What do you do with the message that you've heard? Maybe you're with me and with us this morning for the first time. Your first time in a church, and it's the first time you've heard the elements of the good news, this beneficial kingdom of a great king who favors his devoted followers with all the rich blessings of salvation, and you say, that's not for me. Well, then you must know that of the perilous place in which you stand, that you are not numbered amongst the people of God. But if you embrace that, then you must know where you stand, that you are one of his people, and he is your king. You see, it must be the one or the other. You can't wander away from what you've heard indifferent. There's a temporal judgment, but verse 15, there is a final judgment, explicitly. Truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment. Jesus is referring to that final day, which whether you believe in it or not, you're going to be summoned to it, to stand before the great judge of all of history and of all the earth. And Jesus is saying something solemn here. He's saying that for people who reject the gospel message, it will be more bearable for them than for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. You've heard about Sodom and Gomorrah? Genesis chapter 19. It is the benchmark in the Bible of just and fearful judgment. The inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah were wicked. God said that he was going to obliterate them. Abraham, full of this spirit of freely I've received and so freely that I give, said, no, Lord, spare them. And he pleaded for them. He said, if there are 50 righteous people in those towns, spare them. No, there weren't 50. 45 people. He whittled it down. 5 people. No, there were no righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah. What God was about to do was absolutely earned and fair and just. And if you know the story, you know that fire and brimstone came down from heaven and obliterated those 2 towns. It is the biblical benchmark of fair, just, and fierce judgment. Jesus says, you with your greater light, the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ and him crucified and risen from the dead, if you reject that and all of the gospel blessings that are offered, it will be worse for you than the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's why we tremble. There is so much at stake. They got their marching orders long ago, far away, in a different setting, and in certain respects different from us. But I hope I've managed to show you this morning that there is much that is vitally, bitingly relevant to us, that is enduring, that is timeless. For us as a church, that it gives us our marching orders, tells us what to do, what to say, what attitude ought to be in our hearts, how we ought to sense what's at stake, how we ought to tremble, and how we ought to pray. And it may be saying something to you if you're not a Christian. It will be saying to you, this is good news. Flee from the wrath to come.